give a word of witness, to share your faith, your belief in God. And because of the circumstances of the situation, or because things just weren't going well in your life at that particular moment, you kind of shied away. That certainly was Peter's predicament. There's a different kind of duress, the one that we witnessed in Elijah, where he had actually done what you were supposed to do. He had witnessed for God in a tremendously dramatic fashion. And then because of the awesome nature of it, perhaps, because it was so powerful, maybe he felt drained. And word came that Jezebel was going to kill him because he had slain all the prophets of Baal, and so he just took off. He just ran away. He couldn't face it. And he began to doubt. Doubt not so much in God, and doubt not so much in himself, but doubt that there was anybody left. He thought, I just am alone. And in fact, he did everything he could to isolate himself from everybody else. Clinical diagnosticians these days would call that evidence of depression. Just so you know. We're talking about doubt. We've been talking about doubt the last few weeks. We'll talk about doubt next week as well. Knowing doubt. No doubt. About how to live a real world faith. A faith that faces those kinds of circumstances, those kinds of events in our life. They come to us. There have been times, I suspect, where you've had the opportunity to witness for Christ and you have, shied away from it. There may have been times when you have boldly proclaimed Christ, and then after that moment passed away, you kind of wondered whether or not that was something you really wanted to do, and whether or not you were kind of alone in your faith. Today, let's talk about doubt under duress, doubt under stressful situations. Perry Buffington, a licensed psychologist and author, says failures take on a life of their own because the brain remembers incomplete tasks or failures longer than any success or completed activity. It's technically referred to as the Zeigarnik effect. When a project or thought is completed, the brain places it in a special memory. The brain no longer gives the project priority or active working status, and bits and pieces of the achieved situation begin to decay in our memory. But failures have no closure. The brain continues to spin the memory, trying to come up with ways to fix the mess and move it from active to inactive status. If you've experienced failure, you certainly can continue to churn it over and over and over in your mind. Even when it couldn't be described necessarily as failure. There are many situations in life which remain for us incomplete. Stressful situations that we wish we could recall and redo and make over. A mulligan, a do-over. Could I just have that back? Those kinds of situations are stressful to us because we continue to replay them in our mind and in our spirit. For Elijah, even perhaps his great success was one he kept playing over and over again. And certainly he had to be replaying the fact that Jezebel was after him over and over and over again. Stressful situations. Psychologists also say that even good things, positive things, wonderful events, windfalls of whatever type can be stressful, add stress to our life. So it's not just Elijah and it's not just Peter that we're talking about. We're talking about us. We're talking about the way we live out the faith. We're talking about the situations that we encounter and the lives that we live in the real world here and now. Stressful situations compel confusion. Think of it. Elijah has just confronted all of Baal, all of the worship of Baal, all the prophets of Baal. He's just demonstrated God's power as compared to Baal and demonstrated that there's no question God, the God of Israel, Yahweh, the God who is strong, the God who demonstrates His love and His activity to His people, has the victory. And yet all it takes is the word coming that somebody doesn't like it. Somebody's got a complaint. Not that that ever happens with preachers, mind you, today. And he just wants to take off. He just wants to run. And he exhausts himself in the running. I think it's very interesting how God begins to deal with that. He sends an angel. First of all, Elijah sleeps. That's not a bad thing to do when you're stressed out. Really, take a nap. But then the angel encourages him to eat. Sometimes when you're stressed, sometimes when you're depressed, sometimes when you're anxious, you just get confused to the point where you don't sleep and you don't eat and you don't take care of yourself, and because of that you continue down in a spiral. In an article in the Atlantic magazine, Scott Stossel shares openly about his lifelong attempts to deal with the anguish of anxiety. From an early age, he's been what he calls a twitchy bundle of phobias, fears, and neuroses. Stossel writes, "Even when not actively afflicted by acute episodes of anxiety, I am buffeted by worry." Stossel adds, "Here is what I've tried to deal with my anxiety. Individual psychotherapy, 3 decades of it. Family therapy, group therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, rational emotive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, hypnosis, meditation, role-playing, introspective exposure therapy, in vivo exposure therapy, self-help workbooks, massage therapy, prayer, acupuncture, yoga, Stoic philosophy, and audio tapes I ordered off of a late-night television commercial. And medication. Lots of medication. Thorazine, imipramine, desipramine, chlorpheniramine, I may not get all these right, Nardil, Buspar, Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Wellbutrin, Effexor, Celexa, Lexapro, Cymbalta, Lufox, Trazodone, Levoxil, Indirol, Traxine, Xerax, Syntrax, St. John's Wort, Zolpidem, Valium, Librium, Ativan, Xanax, Clonopin, also beer, wine, gin, bourbon, vodka, and scotch. Here's what worked. Nothing. We have many people, I suspect, Scott is not alone, who have tried everything they can think of and everything that doctors can think of to help them deal with their stress, with their anxiety, with their worry, with their depression, with their whatever you want to call it. And they're still bemuddled. And they're still confused. And it doesn't have to do with them not being good people. And it doesn't have to do with them not being capable people. And it doesn't have to do with them not being intelligent people or even faithful people. Elijah is a leader. He's a prophet. He's a faithful person. And he's at the end of his rope. And he's running away. And he's not just running away from the threat of Jezebel. He's running away, in a sense, from God. He's trying to isolate himself completely from everything because he's uncertain. Peter was wanting to run away in the courtyard. I'm sure he was feeling like he had made a mistake by showing up at that place. He wasn't sure anymore. What's it all about, Alfie? Vanna, give me a vow, something to show me what's up. Stressful situations compel confusion. Sometimes we get confused. I don't know if you've ever experienced that in your spiritual journey. I suspect that many of you have. I suspect that some of you may be experiencing it right now. It is not unusual. It is not unknown. And it's not something that you have to hide. Because faithful people, good people, prophets and disciples, and all kinds of people have experienced it before. Doubt under duress. Stressful situations compel confusion and complicate cure. Makes it difficult. God has to devise this multi-pronged strategy for dealing with Elijah. Jesus has to set up a situation by the Sea of Galilee, a place where Peter, by the way, was very comfortable, to help kind of guide him through that threefold "I love you, feed my sheep" scenario. One writer put it this way: somewhere on the dusty shelf of books I read to my children when they were young is a little volume called "A Hole is to Dig." Each charmingly illustrated page declares the purpose of something. A pile of leaves is to jump in. A mud puddle is to slide in and go oodly, oodly, oo. And so on. The reasoning is sound if you're a child. The world is made for our general entertainment. Gives us things to do and pleasures to revel in. There's something rather poignant about reading the book as an adult. Having developed a much more pragmatic sense of the purposes of things like holes to fill in before someone trips and sues you, or piles of leaves to put in plastic bags before the Thursday pickup, or mud to be scraped off boots before stepping on the carpet. The same pragmatism that turns a tired and jaundiced eye toward holes and mud seems to inform the liturgical sensibility reflected in churches I've attended of late on the purpose of silence. Silence, it seems, is to be filled. Perhaps it would help us to hear more regularly the story of Elijah on Mount Horeb waiting for the Lord to pass by. The Lord, you remember, was not in the great wind, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire, but as the NRSV translates it, in the sound of sheer silence. The church's long history of contemplative practice seems to suggest that there is some knowledge of God that can only come in stillness. Silence, large and long and intentional enough to open a sacred space for the Holy One to enter. Silence is to dwell in. Elijah found it not in his isolation, but in his opening to the possibility that God could walk by. And God, interestingly, reminds him, in the silence, in the stillness, and while he is physically alone, that he is not alone. That there are 3,000 who have not bowed their knee to Baal. Elijah is not alone. Peter is not alone. You are not alone. God does care enough to come, to walk by, to provide, to assure, to restore. William Cowper's poetic achievements are remarkable in light of the fact that mental illness plagued him most of his life. The son of the chaplain to King George II, William worked as a lawyer for several years. At age 32, he was nominated to a position that required a public examination. He grew fearful of that and tried to commit suicide 3 times, nearly succeeded. During his stay of 18 months in the asylum at St. Albans, however, Cowper was converted while reading the book of Romans. After his release, Cowper resided in Huntington with the family of Reverend Unwin. Upon Unwin's death, John Newton came to comfort the family and convinced Mrs. Unwin, her children, and Cowper to move to Olney, where he lived. The period at Olney was a time of healing and spiritual growth for Cowper. Newton urged Cowper to serve Olney's poor, probably in an effort to take Cowper's mind off his depressions, poor health, paranoia, and fears of damnation. He also convinced Cowper to write hymns for the parish's prayer meetings. The result was Olney hymns, published in 1779, which contained 348 hymns, 68 by Cowper, who suffered a relapse and was unable to finish his work. 3 of his best-known works are There Is a Fountain, Safely Through Another Week, and Oh, for a Closer Walk with God. His famous hymn, God Moves in a Mysterious Way, was written about the time of another bout of mental illness, during which Cowper again attempted suicide. Despite this, John Newton said of him, I can hardly form an idea of a closer walk with God than he uniformly maintained. Cowper did not begin his literary career until age 50. His translations of Homer and poems such as John Gilpin placed him at the forefront of English poets, and it is the literary Cowper that is now listed in reference books. But perhaps Cowper's most meaningful works were the hymns, written during fits of despair. It is said that on his deathbed he stated, "I am not shut out of heaven after all." Elijah isn't either. Peter isn't either. You and I aren't either. Stressful situations create confusion and complicate cure. We may have doubt, but doubt does not produce a stain that God finds irrecoverable. Doubt does not cause God to turn his back on us and say that we're unlovely. Doubt does not cause God to give up. And if you are experiencing doubt under duress, I would encourage you not to give up as well. Find strength in the story of Elijah. Find strength in the story of Peter. Find strength in many, many stories of those who have experienced the stresses of life and yet found